Hello dear friends. Welcome back to our channel. As usual, prepare a cup of hot coffee to sip while listening to an interesting story that I bring to you today. Are you ready? Let's get started. About 6 months after his divorce, billionaire Ethan Cole was seated at a business lunch when he froze in shock. One of the waitresses walking across the sleek restaurant floor was none other than his ex-wife, Sarah, visibly pregnant at around 8 months. Ethan adjusted his tailored cuffs, leaning back in his chair. The quiet hum of conversation and the clinking of glasses served as a subtle backdrop to the exclusive venue, a place that matched his meticulously constructed image. Life had fallen into a predictable rhythm for Ethan: corporate deals, board meetings, and occasional charity galas to maintain appearances. His dining companion, an investor from Hong Kong, animatedly outlined plans for expansion into emerging markets. Ethan responded with practiced nods, his face betraying no emotion, but his mind wandered. Securing this deal would unlock massive potential profits, yet it felt hollow. For all his wealth, Ethan often grappled with an inexplicable emptiness that no penthouse, luxury car, or business milestone could seem to fill. As the investor continued talking, Ethan scanned the room absent-mindedly, his gaze settling on a waitress moving deftly between tables. Something about her seemed familiar. Her hair was tied back, and her posture was poised, though slightly weary. When she turned slightly, giving him a fleeting profile view, a jolt of recognition hit him. Ethan blinked, unsure at first, but when her face turned fully toward him, his suspicions solidified. It was Sarah, his ex-wife, who had walked away from their divorce proceedings with grace and determination, was now working as a waitress. As she moved closer to his table, Ethan's breath caught in his throat. It wasn't just seeing Sarah that stunned him. It was her pregnancy. Beneath her apron, her rounded belly was unmistakable. His thoughts raced. Could the child be his? How had he not known? Why hadn't she told him? A storm of questions swirled in his mind, threatening to derail his composure. Mr. Cole? The voice of his investor snapped Ethan back to the present. He realized he had been staring. Clearing his throat, he smoothly apologized. I got momentarily distracted. Could you repeat that? Though he managed to regain his composure outwardly, his eyes kept drifting back to Sarah. She moved through the room with practiced efficiency, her expression guarded, almost detached. It was a stark contrast to the Sarah he had once known, bright, full of life, and able to light up any room. Now, she seemed smaller, diminished. Ethan's tension grew as Sarah approached their table. She carried a pitcher of water and a notepad, her focus seemingly fixed on her work. When she finally reached them, her voice was calm and professional. Good afternoon. Would you like a refill? She didn't meet his gaze as she poured water into his glass. Ethan opened his mouth to speak, but words failed him. What could he possibly say? Hello, I didn't expect to see you here. By the way, are you carrying my child? As he struggled for words, her eyes briefly met his. For an instant, her professional mask faltered, revealing a flicker of recognition. Surprise, pain, maybe even anger. But just as quickly, the moment passed, her expression unreadable once more. Ethan was left sitting there, grappling with the sudden, shocking intersection of their lives. She carried the polite indifference of someone trained in the service industry, expertly masking personal emotions. Would you like to hear the specials? She asked, her tone neutral. Sarah, Ethan said quietly, the name slipping from his lips before he could stop himself. It felt unfamiliar, as though it belonged to a past he could no longer touch. She stiffened but quickly regained her composure. Yes, that's me, she replied briskly, as if it were merely a coincidence and nothing more. His dining companion, oblivious to the tension in the air, nodded and motioned for her to continue. Ethan, however, couldn't pull his eyes away. The moment felt unreal, like a fracture in the carefully built life he had created. Sarah recited the specials with a calm steadiness, but he barely heard a word. His mind fixated on the baby. He needed answers, yet he knew this wasn't the time or place. As she turned to leave, his hand twitched involuntarily, but he stopped himself. She walked away without a glance back, leaving Ethan frozen in his seat, the weight of the encounter pressing down on him. His world had just irrevocably shifted. Staring at the untouched glass of water Sarah had poured, Ethan remained motionless. His dining companion's voice droned on, but none of it registered. All he could think about was Sarah, pregnant and working in this upscale restaurant. The image clashed violently with everything he had assumed about her life post-divorce. Their separation had been amicable, or so he thought. They had mutually agreed to part ways, acknowledging the growing distance his relentless ambition had created. She had wanted more, a family, a partner who would truly be there. He had convinced himself he wasn't ready. But now, watching her across the room, he wondered how much of that had been true. The pregnancy changed everything. He did the math. Judging by her rounded belly, she was around 7 or 8 months along. If the child was his, she would have known before their divorce was finalized. Why hadn't she told him? Did she think he wouldn't care? Or had she decided, after the separation, that she didn't want him involved? The thought made his chest tighten painfully. His mind replayed the ways his detachment and relentless pursuit of success might have pushed her to feel she couldn't rely on him. "Mr. Cole, are we on the same page?" his investor asked, impatience creeping into his voice. Ethan forced a smile, masking the turmoil underneath. "Yes, of course. My apologies. Please continue." The investor resumed his pitch, unaware of the storm in Ethan's thoughts. Ethan nodded at intervals and scribbled meaningless notes, but his focus was entirely on Sarah. She glided between tables, her movements precise and deliberate, avoiding his gaze at all costs. The meeting dragged on, time stretching and contracting unnaturally. When it finally ended, Ethan shook the investor's hand and assured him they'd finalize the deal soon. The man left satisfied, but Ethan remained seated, unable to leave without speaking to her. As Sarah disappeared into the kitchen, Ethan ordered another coffee, buying himself time. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours as he watched her reappear, balancing trays and moving seamlessly through the crowd. She never once glanced in his direction, yet the emotional distance between them felt insurmountable. Eventually, her shift began to wind down. She stopped at the hostess station, untying her apron and chatting briefly with her coworkers. Seeing his chance, Ethan stood and approached her before he could overthink it. "Sarah," he said softly, careful not to draw attention. She froze for a moment, her body language stiffening before she turned to face him. Her expression was carefully neutral, the same professionalism she had displayed earlier. "Ethan," she replied, her tone polite but distant. "Can I help you with something?" "We need to talk," he said, his voice low and insistent. Her eyes flickered with an emotion he couldn't quite place, irritation or maybe resignation. "I'm about to clock out," she replied, glancing at the time on her phone. "If this is about the service, someone else can help." "It's not about the service," Ethan said quickly. "It's about you. About us." She sighed, crossing her arms. "Ethan, this isn't the time or place." "Then when?" he pressed, the urgency in his voice surprising even himself. "Fine," Sarah interrupted, cutting him off. "Meet me outside in 10 minutes. I need to wrap up here first." Ethan nodded, stepping back to give her space. He retreated to the sidewalk, the crisp late-afternoon air biting at his skin. His heart pounded as he leaned against the polished facade of the restaurant, waiting. It had been 6 months since they last spoke, but it felt like no time had passed at all. The unresolved tension between them was as palpable as ever. Sarah emerged a short while later, her coat draped over one arm. She stopped a few steps away from him, her posture guarded. "Well?" she asked, her tone flat. "What is it you wanted to say?" He hesitated, the weight of his emotions momentarily rendering him speechless. Up close, he could see the changes in her more clearly. Her face was softer, fuller, the pregnancy now unmistakable. Yet her eyes still held the same fire, the same resilience he had always admired, even when they were at odds. "You're pregnant," he said finally, the words tumbling out like an accusation rather than a statement. Her jaw tightened, very observant. "Sarah," Ethan began, his voice softer now, "is it mine?" Her expression flickered, and for a brief moment, he caught a glimpse of vulnerability before she looked away. "Does it matter?" she asked, her voice quiet but sharp. "You're not part of my life anymore, Ethan. That was your choice." Her words stung, but he refused to back down. "It does matter. If that child is mine." "You walked away," she said, her voice rising slightly. "You made it clear what your priorities were. I'm not going to beg you to be involved." "That's not fair," he countered. "We both agreed." "We agreed because you left me no choice," she snapped, her composure cracking. "You couldn't make space for a family in your perfect little world, Ethan. So I made the decision to move on. And I'm doing just fine." The silence that followed was heavy, laden with unspoken truths. Ethan wanted to argue, to defend himself, but deep down, he knew she wasn't entirely wrong. His work had consumed him, leaving little room for anything else. Still, he couldn't accept being shut out now, not if this was his child. "I want to be part of this," he said finally, his voice firm. "If the baby is mine, I deserve the chance to step up." Sarah's shoulders sagged slightly, the fight seeming to drain out of her. She looked at him for a long moment, as if weighing his sincerity. "Then you'd better be sure you mean that," she said quietly, her voice steadier now, "because I won't let you come and go as you please. This child deserves better than that." Ethan nodded, the gravity of her words sinking in. He had no idea what the future held, but one thing was clear. His life had changed irrevocably. He stood on the sidewalk long after Sarah walked away, her words echoing in his mind. The certainty with which she had dismissed him, the raw emotion in her voice. It stunned him more than he cared to admit, but it also hardened his resolve. If the child was his, he had a right to know. The next morning, Ethan found himself back in his penthouse, staring out at the sprawling city skyline. The view, which usually invigorated him, did little to calm his restless thoughts. He replayed their brief conversation in his mind, dissecting every word, every inflection. Her refusal to confirm or deny the baby's paternity gnawed at him. Work would have been a welcome distraction, but he couldn't focus. Instead, his thoughts remained fixed on Sarah and the unanswered question that hung between them. Ethan found himself staring blankly at the reports on his desk, his thoughts drifting back to Sarah's face and the tightness in her voice when she accused him of leaving her no choice. Was that how she saw it? That he had abandoned her? The guilt pressed heavily against his chest, a weight he couldn't shake. He needed answers. Later that day, Ethan returned to the restaurant. The dining room was quieter during the mid-afternoon lull, with polished tables gleaming under the soft light. Sarah was there, carrying a tray of drinks to a nearby table. She spotted him immediately, her expression tightening as she approached. "Ethan," she said, her voice clipped. "What are you doing here?" "I wanted to talk," he replied, keeping his tone calm. "About yesterday." "I don't have time for this," she shot back, glancing toward the kitchen. "I'll wait," he said simply. She hesitated, her jaw tightening. Fine, she said after a moment, but not here. When her shift ended, they found a quiet bench outside. The air was crisp, and the sounds of traffic and distant chatter filled the silence between them. Sarah crossed her arms, her posture defensive. "What do you want, Ethan?" she asked, her tone weary. He took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. "I want to understand," he said. "Why didn't you tell me about the baby?" Sarah let out a short laugh, but it was devoid of humor. "What difference would it have made?" she asked, her eyes narrowing. "You made it clear that family wasn't part of your plan." "That's not fair," he countered, his voice rising slightly. "We agreed to the divorce because we thought it was the right thing to do." "You agreed to the divorce because it was convenient for you," she shot back, her voice sharp. "Because it let you keep your focus exactly where you wanted it, on your career." Her words cut deeper than he expected. "That's not true," he said, but even as the words left his mouth, he felt their hollowness. "I cared about us. I cared about you." "Cared," she repeated, her voice dripping with sarcasm. Past tense. "That's exactly the problem, Ethan. You cared when it was easy. But when it came to actually being there, to putting in the work," her voice faltered, and she looked away. Ethan's chest tightened as he watched her. The tension in her posture, the way her hand instinctively rested on her swollen belly, it all struck him deeply. He thought back to the moments that had led them to this point. The slow unraveling of their marriage, the late nights at the office, the missed dinners, the weekends spent buried in work instead of with her. "I never wanted to hurt you," he said quietly. Her gaze snapped back to him, her eyes filled with a mix of anger and sadness. "But you did," she said. "And now you're here wanting what? Closure? Redemption? A way to make yourself feel better." "No," he said firmly. "I'm here because I care. Because if this baby is mine, I want to be involved. I want to do the right thing." She shook her head, letting out a shaky breath. "It's not that simple, Ethan. You can't just swoop in and decide to play father when it suits you. This isn't about you anymore. It's about what's best for this child." Her words hung in the air, heavy and unyielding. Ethan didn't know what to say, how to bridge the chasm that had grown between them. He wanted to tell her he had changed, that he could be better. But even as the thought crossed his mind, he doubted it. Could he really put someone else first after years of prioritizing himself and his ambitions? "I just need to know," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "Is the baby mine?" She stared at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she stood, pulling her coat tighter around herself. "I think you already know the answer to that," she said softly. "But if you want to be part of this, you need to figure out what that actually means. Because I won't let you in halfway, Ethan. Not this time." With that, she walked away, leaving him sitting there. The cold seeped into his skin as he tried to process everything she had said. He felt like a man standing on the edge of a precipice, unsure whether to leap or retreat. He had spent his life meticulously controlling every aspect of his world, only to realize now just how fragile that control had always been. He sat on the bench long after Sarah had left, her words echoing in his mind. He had a choice to make, one that would shape not just his future but hers and the child's. For the first time in years, Ethan wasn't sure what the right decision was. But one thing was clear: he couldn't walk away. Not again. Back in his office, Ethan stared blankly at the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the bustling city. The quiet hum of productivity surrounded him, keyboards clicking, phones ringing, but he barely registered it. His mind was consumed by his conversation with Sarah and the questions she had left unanswered. Her parting words lingered. "I think you already know the answer to that." She was right. He did know. The timelines aligned too perfectly, and the raw emotion in her voice left little doubt. The baby was his. but her declaration that she wouldn't let him in halfway weighed heavily. Restless, Ethan reached for his phone and called his assistant, Emma. As always, she answered on the first ring. "I need you to do something for me," Ethan said, his tone calm but firm. "I need details about Sarah, where she lives, her financial situation, anything you can find." There was a brief pause. "Understood," Emma replied. "I'll be discreet." "Thank you," Ethan said, hanging up without further explanation. He leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers as he stared out the window. He wasn't proud of what he was doing, but he needed clarity. If Sarah wouldn't let him in willingly, he would find another way to understand the life she had been forced to build without him. Within a day, Emma handed him a slim folder. She moved to a new apartment a few months after the divorce, Emma explained as Ethan opened the file. "It's modest, much smaller than the home you shared." Ethan's stomach sank as he flipped through the pages. The address was in a part of the city he hadn't visited in years, a stark contrast to the upscale neighborhood where they had once lived. A photo of the building caught his attention. Old, a little rundown, but clean. It was nothing like the life he had envisioned for Sarah during their marriage. Then again, nothing about her current life matched what he had expected. "She left her job shortly after the divorce," Emma continued. "She's been working as a waitress for a few months. It doesn't seem like a permanent arrangement, more like something to get by." Ethan nodded absently, guilt hitting him like a freight train. While he had buried himself in his work and continued living in comfort, Sarah had been struggling. It wasn't that he doubted her capability. Sarah was one of the strongest people he knew. But seeing the reality of her situation was a stark reminder of how differently they had fared after the divorce. He had rationalized walking away, telling himself it was for the best. But now he wondered if that had been a convenient lie. Sarah had wanted a family, a stable home. Instead, she had been left to navigate the fallout of their failed marriage while carrying a child he hadn't even known about. Flipping to the next page, something caught Ethan's eye. An appointment scheduled at a local clinic in a few days. The details were vague, but given the circumstances, he could guess. "Do you need anything else?" Emma asked, breaking his concentration. Ethan shook his head, closing the folder. "No, this is more than enough. Thank you." Once she left, Ethan sat in silence, his thoughts racing. The appointment felt like an opportunity, though he wasn't entirely sure what he hoped to gain. Answers, perhaps, or maybe just a chance to show Sarah he wasn't walking away this time. On the day of the appointment, Ethan sat in his car outside the clinic, debating whether this was a terrible idea. The small brick building was unassuming, tucked between a pharmacy and a coffee shop. He watched people come and go, his heart pounding harder with each passing moment. When Sarah finally arrived, she moved quickly, her coat pulled tight against the chilly wind. Ethan's breath caught as he saw her. The swell of her belly was more pronounced than before, and he felt a pang of both awe and regret. Sarah looked tired. Her steps were purposeful but lacked the energy he once associated with her. Seeing her like this, alone and burdened, sharpened Ethan's resolve. He stepped out of the car, calling her name softly as he approached. She froze mid-step, her shoulders tensing as she turned to face him. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her tone wary. "I needed to see you," he said, his voice calm but firm. "I saw the appointment on your schedule." Her eyes narrowed, a flicker of anger crossing her face. "You're spying on me now? Is that how you think this works?" "I'm not spying," Ethan said quickly. "I'm trying to understand. You won't talk to me, and I can't just stand by and do nothing." Sarah stared at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she let out a heavy sigh, her shoulders sagging. "This isn't the place for a conversation, Ethan. I'm here for a reason, and it's not to argue with you." "Let me come with you," he said, surprising even himself with the offer. I just want to be there. Please. She hesitated, clearly torn, before finally nodding, though her expression remained guarded. Fine, but this doesn't mean anything, Ethan. Don't read into it. He followed her inside, the sterile smell of the clinic washing over him. Sarah checked in at the front desk, her movements precise and deliberate, while Ethan stood a few steps behind, feeling out of place. The waiting room was small and quiet, filled with muted conversations and the occasional call of a name. They sat together, an uneasy silence stretching between them. Ethan wanted to say something, anything, but couldn't find the right words. Sarah, for her part, seemed intent on ignoring him, her focus fixed on the clipboard she had been handed. When her name was called, she stood without looking at him. Ethan rose as well, but she held up a hand to stop him. You wait here, she said firmly. This part is mine. He nodded, sinking back into his chair as she disappeared through the door. Her words settled over him like a weight. He wasn't sure what he had expected, that she would welcome him in or that they would suddenly find common ground. But now, more than ever, he understood how far he had to go to earn her trust. Ethan sat in the waiting room, his fingers laced tightly together as he leaned forward on the hard plastic chair. The quiet hum of the clinic felt deafening, each minute stretching into eternity. His mind raced, conjuring countless scenarios. What if Sarah refused to speak to him after this? What if she left without saying another word, cementing the wall she had built between them? He barely noticed when the door opened and Sarah emerged. Her expression was unreadable as she approached, stopping a few feet away. Her gaze flicked to the other people in the waiting room before settling on him. Let's go, she said quietly, her tone firm but restrained. Ethan stood and followed her outside into the chilly afternoon. They walked in silence down the block, the distant sounds of traffic filling the air between them. Finally, Sarah stopped at a quiet corner, turning to face him. Her arms were crossed over her chest, her coat wrapped tightly around her. But Ethan suspected it wasn't just the cold she was shielding herself from. Okay, Ethan, she said, her voice low but laced with frustration. What do you want? Why are you doing this? I'm doing this because I care, he said, his voice steady. Because you're pregnant, and I have a right to know. It's yours, she cut him off, the words sharp but decisive. Ethan blinked, momentarily stunned by her admission. He had suspected as much, but hearing her confirm it hit him harder than he had anticipated. Relief, fear, and guilt swirled within him, tightening his chest. When were you planning to tell me? He asked, his tone softer now. Sarah let out a bitter laugh, shaking her head. I wasn't, she admitted. I wasn't going to tell you at all. The honesty in her words stung, but Ethan forced himself to stay calm. Why? He asked quietly. Why wouldn't you tell me? She sighed, her shoulders sagging slightly as the tension drained from her stance. Because I didn't think it would make a difference, she said. Because I didn't want to disrupt your perfect little life. Sarah, he began, but she held up a hand, cutting him off again. No, Sarah said firmly, raising a hand to stop him. You need to hear this. Her voice trembled slightly, but her resolve was unshaken. I found out I was pregnant right after the divorce was finalized. Do you know how hard that was? To realize I was carrying your child, knowing you'd already moved on, that you'd made it clear there was no room in your life for this? That's not fair, Ethan said, his voice rising slightly. I didn't know. You didn't want to know, Sarah shot back, her eyes blazing. You made your priorities clear, Ethan. Work came first. It always did. So I decided not to burden you with something you clearly didn't want. The words landed like a punch to the gut. Ethan wanted to argue, to defend himself, but deep down, he knew there was truth in what she was saying. He had spent their marriage consumed by his ambition, always chasing the next big deal, the next milestone, while Sarah had been left to fend for herself emotionally. "I never would have walked away if I'd known," he said, his voice softer but firm. "You should have told me, Sarah. I deserve to know." "And then what?" she asked, her tone sharp. "You'd have swooped in, made some grand gesture, and then gone right back to your high-rise office while I raised the baby on my own?" "No, Ethan. I wasn't going to do that. I wasn't going to set myself up for more disappointment." Her words stung, but Ethan couldn't deny the logic behind them. "I can't change the past," he said, his voice steady, "but I can be here now. I want to be part of this, Sarah. I want to be part of our child's life." She studied him for a long moment, her expression softening just enough to reveal the pain beneath her anger. "And why is that, Ethan?" she asked quietly. "Because you suddenly care? Or because you feel guilty?" The question cut deep. Ethan hesitated, struggling to find the right words. "I care," he said finally. "I've always cared, even when I didn't show it. And I'm not doing this out of guilt. I'm doing this because it's the right thing to do. This child deserves to have a father." Sarah let out a slow breath, her gaze dropping to the ground. "I don't know if I can trust you," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've spent months preparing to do this on my own. Letting you in. It's not that simple." Ethan took a step closer, his voice quiet but resolute. "I know I have a lot to prove," he said, "but I'm not going anywhere this time. You and this baby, you're not a burden, Sarah. You're my family, and I want to be there for you, for both of you, in any way I can." Her eyes flicked up to meet his, and for the first time, he saw something beyond anger or frustration. There was vulnerability, a crack in the armor she had carefully constructed. "You have a long way to go, Ethan," she said finally, "and I can't promise anything. But if you're serious about being part of this, you'll have to show me. Words aren't enough anymore." "I will," he said, his voice steady. "I'll prove it to you." Sarah nodded, though doubt lingered in her eyes. "We'll see," she said softly, her tone more resigned than hopeful. "But don't think for a second that I'll let you hurt this child, or me again." "I wouldn't expect you to," he said. The tension between them eased slightly, though the weight of their shared history remained. As they stood there, the reality of what lay ahead settled over them both. Ethan knew it wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in years, he felt like he was fighting for something that truly mattered. Back at his penthouse that evening, Ethan replayed Sarah's words in his head. The conversation outside the clinic had left him raw, but it also lit a fire within him. He wasn't the same man he had been 6 months ago, or at least, he didn't want to be. Sarah was right to doubt him, to demand more than empty promises. If he wanted to prove himself, it would have to be through actions, not words. The first step came the next morning. Ethan cleared his schedule, canceling meetings, postponing deals, and delegating responsibilities he once would have clung to out of sheer pride. His assistant, Emma, was stunned but professional. "Are you sure about this?" she asked. "These are high-priority items." "I'm sure," Ethan replied firmly. "I need to focus on something else for a while." With work no longer consuming his every waking moment, Ethan turned his attention to Sarah. He started small, texting to check in, offering support where he could. Ethan started small, offering to help Sarah with errands or appointments. At first, her responses were curt, bordering on dismissive. She was polite but guarded, and he couldn't blame her. He had a long way to go to earn her trust. His first breakthrough came when he asked to accompany her to a prenatal class. It was an awkward request, and he braced himself for rejection. To his surprise, she agreed, albeit reluctantly. "Don't make me regret this," she warned as they arrived at the small community center where the class was held. The session was both enlightening and humbling. Ethan fumbled with the baby doll they were instructed to diaper, much to the amusement of the other soon-to-be parents. Sarah rolled her eyes, but couldn't hide a faint smile as she corrected his clumsy attempts. "You're supposed to fold it like this," she said, demonstrating with ease. "Show off," he muttered, though his teasing tone betrayed his warmth. It was a small moment, but to Ethan, it felt monumental. For the first time in months, he caught a glimpse of the Sarah he remembered. The one who laughed easily and had once been his partner in everything. It gave him hope, however fragile, that they could rebuild something resembling a partnership. Over the following weeks, Ethan continued to show up. He joined Sarah for more classes, brought her groceries when she was too tired to shop, and even helped assemble the crib she had ordered for the baby. It wasn't easy. There were moments when her defenses flared, and she reminded him sharply that she wasn't ready to forgive or forget. But he didn't let it deter him. Every small step forward felt like progress. In the process, Ethan began rediscovering parts of himself he had long buried beneath the weight of ambition. He found joy in the simpler things. Cooking a meal, picking out baby clothes, listening to Sarah talk about her plans for the nursery. These were tasks he had once dismissed as distractions, but now they felt grounding, meaningful in a way his corporate victories never had. Sarah, for her part, started to soften. She still kept him at arm's length emotionally, but there were moments when her guard slipped. One afternoon, as they sat on the floor sorting through baby clothes, she glanced at him and said quietly, "I didn't think you'd actually stick around." Her voice was vulnerable, and Ethan felt a pang of regret for all the times he had let her down. "I'm not going anywhere," he said simply. "I mean it." They settled into a tentative rhythm, a fragile but growing partnership as they prepared for the baby's arrival. There were awkward moments, like when Ethan's attempt to hang a mobile ended with a broken light fixture, much to Sarah's exasperation. But there were tender moments too, like the first time he felt the baby kick. Sarah had been sitting on the couch, her hands resting lightly on her belly, when she suddenly grabbed his hand. "Here," she said, guiding it to the right spot. "Feel that." Ethan's eyes widened as he felt the tiny flutter beneath his palm. "That's incredible," he said, his voice filled with awe. Sarah smiled, and for a fleeting moment, the distance between them seemed to disappear. It didn't last long. She pulled away soon after, retreating behind her walls, but it was enough to remind Ethan of what he was fighting for. As the weeks passed, their bond continued to grow. Their conversations became less guarded. Sarah opened up about her fears of being a single mother and whether she could give the baby everything it needed. Ethan, in turn, shared his regrets about how his obsession with success had blinded him to what truly mattered. "You deserved better," he admitted one evening as they sat together in her small living room. "I didn't see it then, but I do now." Sarah didn't respond right away. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft. "You're trying," she said. "That means something." It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a start. Ethan found himself changing in ways he hadn't anticipated. Scaling back his work commitments had initially felt like a sacrifice, but now it felt like freedom. He rediscovered the part of himself that cared deeply, that found joy in life's little moments. He also began to see Sarah in a new light, not just as his ex-wife or the mother of his child, but as a strong, resilient woman who had built a life for herself despite the odds. He couldn't help but admire her. Their journey wasn't linear. There were setbacks, arguments, and moments when old wounds resurfaced. But with each passing day, they took one step closer to building something new. It wasn't the same as what they had before, and maybe that was a good thing. Maybe this time, they could get it right. The weeks leading up to the due date were filled with a cautious but growing sense of partnership between Ethan and Sarah. They had fallen into a tentative rhythm, preparing for their child's arrival. Ethan found himself spending more time at her apartment than he ever expected, assembling furniture, organizing baby supplies, and occasionally burning dinner in his well-meaning but clumsy attempts to help. Sarah seemed to warm to him, her walls gradually lowering, though they were still far from the easy companionship they once shared. For Ethan, it was enough. He had learned to cherish the small victories, her rare, genuine smiles, the moments when she leaned on him, figuratively and sometimes literally, when the weight of her pregnancy became too much. But the calm they had built together shattered one stormy evening when Ethan's phone rang. He was working late in his home office, poring over a plan to restructure part of his company. The storm outside was fierce. Rain slammed against the windows, and thunder rattled the glass. When Sarah's name flashed on the screen, his chest tightened with worry. "Sarah," he answered quickly. Her voice was strained, barely above a whisper. "Ethan, it's time. I think. The baby's coming." The world around him blurred as her words sank in. "Where are you?" he asked, already grabbing his keys. "At home," she replied, her breath hitching. "I tried calling an ambulance, but the storm—" "I'm coming," he interrupted, his voice steady despite the panic rising in his chest. "Just hold on." The drive to her apartment was a nightmare. The storm had worsened, rain pounding relentlessly against his windshield. Roads were slick, visibility was nearly zero, and he had to swerve to avoid fallen branches and debris. At one point, he encountered a flooded intersection and was forced to backtrack, cursing under his breath as the clock ticked on. Ethan gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white. He couldn't let her go through this alone. The thought of Sarah in pain, scared, and without support drove him forward despite the treacherous conditions. This wasn't just about being there for the birth of his child. It was about proving to Sarah and to himself that he could be the man she needed him to be. By the time he reached her apartment complex, the storm had knocked out the power. The building was dark, illuminated only by the occasional flash of lightning. Ethan parked haphazardly and ran through the rain, his clothes soaked by the time he reached her door. He knocked urgently, calling her name. The door opened, and Sarah stood there, pale and trembling. Relief flickered across her face when she saw him. "Ethan," she said, her voice weak but steady. "I didn't think you'd make it." "I told you I would," he said, stepping inside and wrapping an arm around her. "Let's get you to the hospital." Sarah nodded, wincing as another contraction hit. Ethan supported her as they made their way to the car, shielding her as best he could from the relentless rain. Every second felt like an eternity as he drove toward the nearest hospital, his focus split between navigating the storm and comforting her. "It hurts," she admitted through clenched teeth, her hand gripping the armrest tightly. "I know," he said softly but resolutely. "We're almost there. Just hang on." When they finally arrived at the hospital, the power was running on backup generators. Nurses met them at the entrance, quickly assessing Sarah's condition and rushing her to a delivery room. Ethan followed, his heart pounding as the chaos unfolded around them. For the next several hours, time stretched and compressed in strange ways. Sarah gripped his hand so tightly he thought his fingers might break, but he didn't let go. He stayed by her side, murmuring words of encouragement and reassurance, even as his own fear threatened to overwhelm him. "You're doing great," he said, brushing a damp strand of hair from her forehead. "You're incredible." She shot him a tired but skeptical look. "Don't patronize me," she managed between labored breaths. He chuckled softly despite the tension. "I mean it. You're the strongest person I know." The delivery was long and grueling, but eventually, the sound of a baby's first cry filled the room. Ethan's breath caught as he looked at their son for the first time. The tiny, wriggling infant in the nurse's arms was red-faced and crying loudly, but to Ethan, he was perfect. Tears welled in his eyes as he glanced at Sarah, who looked utterly exhausted but radiant in that moment. "You did it," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. She gave him a tired smile, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "We did it." The baby was tiny and perfect, resting in the doctor's hands. The nurse gently placed him on Sarah's chest, and tears streamed down her face as she gazed at him. "He's beautiful," she whispered, her voice filled with awe. Ethan leaned over, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. "He is," he agreed, his voice thick with emotion, "just like his mother." Sarah glanced up at him, her expression softening in a way he hadn't seen in years. For a moment, the weight of their past seemed to fade, replaced by the shared joy of the new life between them. Later, in the quiet of the hospital room, Ethan sat beside Sarah as she cradled their son. The storm outside had passed, leaving a serene stillness in its wake. Ethan couldn't take his eyes off the baby, marveling at the tiny fingers that curled around his own. "What should we name him?" he asked softly. Sarah smiled, exhaustion evident but her eyes bright. "I was thinking James," she said. "It was my grandfather's name." Ethan nodded, his chest tightening with emotion. "James," he repeated. "It's perfect." They sat in silence for a while, the weight of the moment settling over them. Finally, Sarah looked at him, her expression unreadable. "You were there," she said quietly, "when it mattered most. You were there." "I told you I would be," he replied. "And I will be, Sarah, for both of you, always." Tears welled in her eyes, and she reached out, her fingers brushing against his. "I'm scared, Ethan," she admitted, "of letting you in again, of getting hurt." "I know," he said, his voice steady, "and I'll spend the rest of my life proving to you that you can trust me." For the first time in what felt like forever, Sarah allowed herself to lean on him, resting her head against his shoulder as James slept peacefully in her arms. It wasn't a perfect reconciliation. It would take time, effort, and patience. But in that moment, they both knew they were ready to try. Together. The weeks after James's birth were a blur of sleepless nights, endless diaper changes, and moments of pure joy Ethan had never experienced before. His world had shifted on its axis, and everything he thought he understood about life and priorities now seemed trivial compared to the weight of holding his son in his arms. Ethan spent every spare moment at Sarah's apartment, helping with feedings, soothing James during his fussy spells, and learning the nuances of caring for a newborn. It was exhausting, humbling work, but he embraced it with an intensity that surprised even himself. He marveled at the smallest things. James's tiny fingers curling around his own, the way his face scrunched up before he cried, the soft coos he made while drifting off to sleep. Sarah watched Ethan's transformation with cautious optimism. She could see the effort he was putting in, the sincerity in his actions. He was there, not just physically but emotionally, in a way he had never been during their marriage. Still, the wounds of their past ran deep, and she struggled to let go of the fear that he might revert to old habits. One evening, after James had finally settled down for the night, Ethan and Sarah sat together on the couch. The silence between them was heavy but not uncomfortable. "I've been thinking," Ethan said, his expression thoughtful. "I know we can't fix everything overnight, but I want us to try. Not just for James, but for us. For what we used to have." Sarah hesitated, her gaze dropping to her hands. "It's not that simple, Ethan," she said softly. "There's a lot we haven't dealt with, a lot we need to work through." "I know," he said, leaning forward. "That's why I think we should go to therapy. Together." Her eyes widened slightly, surprise flickering across her face. "Therapy?" "Yeah," he said. "I've been looking into it. There are counselors who specialize in helping couples navigate complicated histories. I think it could help us." Sarah was quiet for a long moment, her thoughts racing. The idea of revisiting their pain, of digging into the moments that had led to their divorce, was daunting. But the sincerity in Ethan's voice, the determination in his eyes, made her pause. He wasn't just saying what he thought she wanted to hear. He meant it. "Okay," she said finally. "I'll try. For James." Ethan nodded, a small smile tugging at his lips. "For James," he agreed. But deep down, he hoped it could be for them too. The first therapy session was awkward, to say the least. They sat stiffly on opposite ends of the couch, unsure of how to begin. The counselor, a kind but firm woman named Dr. Lennox, guided them through the process, encouraging honesty and vulnerability. At first, it was hard. Sarah found herself revisiting old wounds she thought she had buried, while Ethan had to confront the ways his ambition had overshadowed their marriage. "I felt invisible," Sarah admitted during one session, her voice trembling, "like I was just there. You didn't see me, Ethan." "Not really." Her words hit him like a punch to the gut, but he didn't shy away. "I was wrong," he said quietly. "I thought I was building something for us, but I wasn't paying attention to what you needed. I was selfish, and I'm sorry." Dr. Lennox nodded, encouraging them to dig deeper, to confront the emotions they had avoided for so long. Slowly, over weeks of sessions, they began to untangle the web of resentment and miscommunication that had defined their past. It wasn't easy. There were moments of frustration, tears, and even anger, but they stuck with it, determined to build something stronger, not just for James, but for themselves. Outside of therapy, their dynamic began to shift. Ethan continued to show up in meaningful ways, not just as a father, but as a partner. He listened when Sarah talked about her day, offered to cook dinner with varying degrees of success, and even took overnight feedings so she could rest. Sarah, in turn, began to trust him more, letting him in little by little. She began to see glimpses of the man she had fallen in love with, the one who had always been there but had gotten lost along the way. One afternoon, as they were sorting through James's clothes, Sarah glanced at Ethan and said, "You're really trying, aren't you?" He looked up, surprised by the softness in her tone. "I am," he said simply, "because you and James are worth it." The honesty in his words brought tears to her eyes, and for the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they could find their way back to each other. Months passed, and their bond continued to grow. Therapy became a space where they could be honest without fear of judgment, and the work they put in began to pay off. They laughed more, argued less, and found joy in the little moments they shared as a family. One evening, as they sat in the living room, Ethan cradled James in his arms, his expression one of pure contentment. Sarah watched them, her heart swelling with emotion. The sight of Ethan with their son, so gentle and attentive, filled her with a warmth she hadn't felt in years. "You're good with him," she said softly. Ethan looked up, his eyes meeting hers. "I had a good teacher," he replied with a small smile. Sarah laughed, shaking her head. "Don't give me too much credit. You've come a long way, Ethan. I'm proud of you." Her words took him by surprise, and for a moment, he couldn't speak. When he finally did, his voice was filled with emotion. "That means everything to me, Sarah. Thank you." As James stirred in his arms, Ethan gently rocked him, his movements instinctive and tender. Sarah leaned back against the couch, a sense of peace washing over her. They still had a long way to go, but for the first time in years, she felt hopeful about their future. The room was quiet, save for the soft sound of James's breathing. Ethan looked down at their son, his heart full, and then back at Sarah. "I love you," he said, the words simple but profound. Sarah's breath caught, her eyes glistening with tears. "I love you too," she whispered. In that moment, As they sat together with their son between them, they knew they had found something worth fighting for. A new beginning, a second chance, a family. The story of Ethan, Sarah, and baby James reminds us of the transformative power of love, forgiveness, and second chances. It's never too late to grow, to make amends, and to rebuild what was lost, especially when it comes to family. What did you think of their journey? Let us know in the comments below. Would you give someone a second chance? Or do you think some bridges should stay burned? If you enjoyed this story, be sure to hit the like button and share it with someone who loves a good tale of redemption. Don't forget to subscribe for more heartwarming and thought-provoking stories like this one. And turn on the notification bell so you never miss an upload. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.